Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CIGI. Thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. In spite of the construction challenges in this neighborhood, I'd also like to thank our public event sponsor, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of the CIGI Signature Lecture Series. We also thank those who are joining us live at the CIGI campus and through our live webcast online. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from both audiences. If you're here in the auditorium, you can ask questions at the microphones at the bottom of the stairs. And if you're watching online, you can ask questions through the live chat function on your screen. Please remember to state your name and to keep the questions brief. Humans have a long-standing fascination with heroes and victims of past conflicts. We talk about their triumphs and sacrifices, write books, script movies, and build social media campaigns, all with the purpose of memorializing their contributions. In the case of historically significant conflicts and wars, commemoration often takes the form of a permanent installation, a memorial, a monument. Tonight, Professor Ed Linenthal will speak to us about what our commitment to memorializing heroes and victims of war says about our society, and he'll discuss the interplay between place and memory. Here to introduce tonight's speaker more properly is James Blight, a professor at the University of Waterloo and the Balsley School of International Affairs. Jim, and his longtime partner Janet Lang are both experts of history and international affairs. She's with us here tonight as well. He'll explain more. They received their doctoral degrees from the Harvard John F. Kennedy School of Government. And Jim and Janet are best known for the development and application of critical oral history and innovative research methodology. So please join me now in welcoming Jim and Janet.
It's a pleasure to be here to introduce Ed Linenthal. Ed Linenthal has the distinction of possibly inventing an entirely new kind of history. I'll get to that in a second. But Ed's come all the way up here from southern Indiana, where he's picked up a bit of a southern accent over the years, even though he lived in Wisconsin for a long time. We have a sliding clock, yeah? We were making sure that he wore warm clothing, but that was like a week and a half ago when it was really amazingly cold. And so he showed up looking like Nanook of the North on a day that's sort of mild out there. Now, second pre-point is I have breaking news that I'd like to share, which is that Janet Lang, who will be sitting over there as the kind of traffic director in the Q&A, a few hours ago emerged from her last chemotherapy session of 6 months. This lady with 2 doctoral degrees, I believe, is as proud of that and as happy about that as she is about anything that she's ever been awarded. She didn't know about that. You look great. Yes, we've been married for 38 years, and based on the results of this chemotherapy, we might have a few more in us. Now, when the Q&A comes, Janet's going to be kind of shuffling through some papers and so forth. There'll be 2 opportunities for you to write out your question, pass it out, roughly the midpoint, and then at the end. And then she'll be the kind of traffic control officer while she feeds Ed these difficult questions. Now, this present moment, a century after the outbreak of the First World War, is heavy with symbolism of war, sacrifice, and heroism. This is especially true here in Canada, whose losses in the Great War were horrendous. Tens of thousands of Canadians died on the Western Front out of a population of roughly 7.5 million. Everybody tells us we have to remember. Never forget. Not let the heroes die in vain. But what are we supposed to remember? How can we remember something, say World War I, that we never experienced? You saw Harry Patch, the last World War I veteran, died at age 111 in 2009. That's it. That's the end of that game. None of us remember World War I. Supposing we figure all this stuff out, who are the victors, who are the villains, who are the heroes, the good guys and the bad guys, how do we decide the manner in which we commemorate or memorialize the heroes and implicitly denigrate the villains? Ed Linenthal's work is all about who owns the past anyway. The answer to all these tough questions about memory and the past, according to our speaker tonight, and I urge you not to leave because he's got a lot more to say than I'm going to give him in this sentence. It goes something like this: memories, monuments, parades, textbook presentations, holidays, bad guys, good guys, all of this stuff are decided by knockdown, drag-out dogfights whose intensity often rivals that of the violent events everybody claims to remember. The difference is that the combatants in the war for the ownership of history usually fight with words instead of bullets. But as with the war itself, the stakes are regarded as very high, and victory over the adversary is the only acceptable objective. Many in the historical profession, and my brother is a member of that profession, and he confirms this, and since he teaches at Yale, what he says is true. Ed Linenthal virtually invented the historical subdiscipline of scholars who study the competition for a share of the memory of violent events. Ed is modest, so he will deny this. He'll point out that the ancient Greeks got involved with memorializing their war a few years before he did. Okay, I accept that. But no historian on this planet has taught us more than Ed about the process of memorializing our heroes and victims of violence. He's the author of many books and articles that have defined this field of public history, and he has won many awards as a scholar. Just to give you a flavor of the kind of thing he's into, his 1991 book, Sacred Ground, Americans and Their Battlefields, he examined the processes of veneration, defilement, and redefinition at 5 highly loaded controversial sites: Lexington and Concord, the Alamo, Gettysburg, Little Bighorn, and Pearl Harbor. And even myself, with a very sort of superficial knowledge of all this, I understand that each of these has good guys and bad guys, but not everybody agrees on who the bad guys are and who the good guys are. With this project, Ed began an ongoing and very productive relationship with the United States National Park Service. Ed worked with the Park Service on the 50th anniversary ceremonies at Pearl Harbor and delivered the commemorative address at the memorial in 1994. He's a longtime consultant to the Park Service on the interpretation of controversial historic sites, including a decade as a member of the Federal Advisory Commission for the Memorial to the Passengers and Crew of Flight 93, which crashed near Shanksville, Pennsylvania on September 11, 2001. But wait, there's another Ed Linenthal who is the editor-in-chief of the flagship journal of the Organization of American Historians, the Journal of American History. As a sort of academic, I cannot understand how he does this, why anyone would want this thankless job. I can confirm right now publicly what many of you have long suspected. Academia is top-heavy with neurotic, self-involved, bubble-headed, egomaniacal head cases. Ed, what did I leave out? That's okay? If Ed and his staff and reviewers decide not to publish a piece, the author is furious. If they decide to publish a piece pending a few changes recommended by a reviewer, the author is also furious, because the corrections or adjustment were suggested by people who are obviously idiots, who seem not to know who I am. To maintain your sanity as the editor of a flagship scholarly journal, you will go insane if you lack a sense of humor, a deep, profound, theater of the totally absurd sense of humor. Fortunately, our distinguished speaker tonight arrived at the Journal of American History already gifted as an absurdist. How, you ask? Because he grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and has been cursed since birth by a proclivity to root for the University of Michigan football team. I graduated from that university, and I am a fellow sufferer. As some of you may know, tomorrow is the annual ritual killing of the Michigan Wolverines by the Ohio State Buckeyes, an event we will watch together at our home with the fascination equal to that of Londoners in the 1500s who showed up for the decapitation of Henry VIII's latest sacrificial wife. The saintly Albert Schweitzer's motto was reverence for life. Our speaker might be slightly less saintly than Schweitzer, but his motto could be irreverence for life. It's made it possible for him to navigate the minefields of public history, to face down the prima donnas of academia, and to return year after year to Michigan Stadium, no matter how absurd the performance of the home team. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Edward Linenthal.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for spending your evening here. I appreciate it very much. Jim Blight and Janet Lang have been dear, dear friends for a very long time. We met in 1986 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So it's really a pleasure to be here. And if there are any therapists in the house, Jim and I will give you our phone number for after the Michigan-Ohio State game, and we hope that you'll give us a call because we will have some PTSD issues, I think. Now, before we get to the topic at hand, serious topic at hand, I did want to bring up one thing that has greatly troubled me this afternoon that I thought our neighbors to the north had avoided. But I understand that Black Friday has now infected Canada. This is not good. And I think instead of my talk, we should band together and go to the border and do something about we have to stop this. It can't go on any longer. It's just the worst. All right. So I'm going to do something new tonight for me, and I'm picking on some people as heroes and heroines that might seem a little bit different. And I'm doing that for a particular reason because all of these people and the places that their stories bring alive are involved in memory projects that are incredibly interesting. At least they are to me. And I want to think about this oral testimony that you're going to hear, and then think out from it. So what I'm going to do is to play you 3 short pieces of oral history. 2 of them are 6 minutes, 1 of them is 12 minutes, and talk with you in between. The first one is of a Tuskegee Airman, Lieutenant Colonel Charles W. Dryden, talking about his reception in the United States when he returns from combat in Europe. It's part of the stunning oral history project at the Tuskegee National Historic Site. The interview that I have was given me very generously by Todd Moy, who now directs the oral history project at the University of North Texas. Todd directed the oral history project at Tuskegee. The second and slightly longer piece you're going to see is about 12 minutes, and it's from the final 117-minute film that concludes the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And the third piece is a 6-minute pilot that was shown by one of the groups that applied to do the permanent exhibition in the Memorial Center at Oklahoma City and did in fact receive the bid to do that. If any of you have been or go, you will see these clips. This is a 6-minute clip as well. So let's set the stage for the first one. I cut some of this out for length issues. So Colonel Dryden is doing this interview with Todd, and he has just finished telling Todd about their return from Europe, and they went to Selfridge Field in Michigan, where they were stationed, and tried without any success to integrate the officers' club there. And rather than integrate the club, the officer in charge closed the club to everyone, and then put Dryden and other Tuskegee Airmen on a train to their new base in South Carolina. And so it's at that point that Todd will pick up this discussion, asking Colonel Dryden to tell him about the trip, and I'll give you a little bit of what is a stunning moment, I think, of his experience in South Carolina. Please.
We'll get to the point of the story.
Tell me about the train ride down there.
Huh?
The train ride to Walterboro?
Yeah, overnight train ride. We didn't know where we were going. We boarded the train at night, and the first stations that we saw through the windows were stations in Canada. So we'd been transported over into Canada, and then back to the States and down through the Mohawk Valley in the state of New York. We recognized Pennsylvania Station, and New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Washington, D.C., Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. And we ended up in Walterboro, South Carolina, deep in the South. When the train pulled up at a siding, there were armed guards about every 100 yards with carbines, nothing but trees all around. So the first thought occurred to me and the rest of us was that we were being interned as the Japanese Americans had been out on the West Coast. But it turned out it was an Army air base where we were going to be trained. And when we got off the train, we were taken by truck to some World War I type of shanty barracks. Very basic accommodations, a cot, a steel cot, a mattress, no mattress covers, no pillow slips, or anything like that. So the guys decided to, it was a Sunday that we arrived, they decided to go find a movie and see a movie and relax. And I wanted to make sure that all the men had at least quarters and so forth, since I was a senior ranking. Not by any designation, it's just that everybody sort of looked up to the fact that my classmates and myself were in, I was the only one of my classmates who was sent back as an instructor. So I made sure that everybody was billeted and had some sort of basic accommodation. So I took the time taking my shower, and I put on a fresh uniform and walked down a pathway to the theater. And it's almost like the boondocks, you know. When I arrived at the theater, it was about a 3/4 mile walk. The guys were all standing in formation. And there were just a couple of pilots with a lot of enlisted men who had gone to the movie. So as I approached the theater, there was a second lieutenant, Bayless, who called the men to attention, and he reported to me. He says, Lieutenant Dryden, Lieutenant Bayless reporting. So I said, Bayless, what's going on here? He said, well, we went into the theater, and there was a rope down the middle of the theater, blacks on one side, whites on the other. So the men promptly cut the rope, and they sat, they checkerboarded, two over here, one there, all over the place. So the tech sergeant, who was the theater operator, movie operator, refused to start the film until they restored the segregated seating order. And so the men decided to file out of the theater and call the officer of the day, which they did. And after I'd heard that, I was saying, well, where is the officer of the day? And he heard me, and he said, I'm right here, Lieutenant. He was a major. He had the armband on and the gun. And I said, well, Major, what's going on here? He said, well, these men are trying to sit all over the theater, and that's not the rule down here. You have to be segregated, and that's the way it is, and that's the way it'll be. So I said, well, where can I get in touch with the base commander? He said, not till tomorrow. He's not on base, but I'm in charge here until he comes back on base. And you men just going, you're not up north now. You have to do what the custom is down here in the south. So I said to the men, I said, well, you've heard what we said. We have to wait till tomorrow to talk to the base commander. But some of the men said, well, can I at least get my money back? It was 15 cents to see the movie. And I asked the major, I said, well, what about that? He said, well, okay. He told the sergeant, refund those who wanted their money. Some of them took the money and threw it in the dirt and said, I'll be damned, I don't want this money. You know, they need it for a course in courtesy or something. Well, the next day, the base commander called an officer's call, and he made it quite plain that that's the way the things were going to be. Well, we knew that we were in a catch basket, you might say. So people began to write to people in Washington, their Congress people and lawyers and so forth. We took the precaution not to mail the letters on base, but to take them off base and mail them hither and yon. So they couldn't be intercepted and so forth, censored. Well, I said at the beginning it was a painful experience for me because when I saw something on that base, I just cracked. I'd been trained to be a pretty good, but before I went to the military, I was a pretty disciplined person for my upbringing. But in addition to that, I had had the 8 months of military training. But I saw German prisoners of war on that base that could do things that we couldn't do. Now, we had been fighting the Germans, 8 of us. We had returned from the States from having defended the country as we raised our right hand and swore to do. And in our country, the enemy could do things we couldn't do. 60 years later, I find it very hard to maintain my composure as I relate that.
Think how stories like this bring alive a place like Tuskegee. Think how stories like this complicate, certainly for Americans, the much too easy formulaic of the good war. This is one of the videos that I play for my students in the course on World War II that I teach, an upper-level undergraduate course. And they know by this time that I believe to the deepest fiber of my being that we were fighting ultimate evil in this war and that this was a necessary war. But a good war, this template that has become far too popular in the United States, is one that is subverted by these kinds of really important stories. And so one way to think about deepening our understanding of World War II is listening to these kinds of stories. Deepening our understanding of the turbulent American homeland during World War II. Deepening our understanding that the virus of race that we were fighting, both in the Pacific and in Europe, was still alive in the United States. This video is also, you get into history for all kinds of reasons, and a lot of them are personal. And when I saw this, when Todd Moy first showed it to me at a conference, it jerked me back to when I was, I think, 8 or 9 years old, living in Ithaca, New York, where my mother was finishing her degree in political science. And I remember to this day, walking down the street with her telling me that there had been a German POW camp not so far away, and that German POWs on their way back from work details could go in and buy Coca-Cola, and black American GIs could not. And that, whatever it is, a complete incoherence of understanding has stayed with me to this day. And a sense of wanting to identify hypocrisy and this kind of bitter irony that we see here, I'm sure is one of the reasons that I ended up doing what I do. But besides subverting the good war narrative, this illustrates, as do other stories, how these kinds of tales bring alive sites of memory. And the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site joins many other sites around the world. For example, sites in the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. And their mission statement reads like this: Our members are diverse in every sense. They range from long-standing historic sites to emerging memory initiatives, remember a wide variety of history, and address an equally wide range of issues, but they are united by their common commitment to connect past to present, memory to action. So this web of sites, 185 now around the world, these places that link memory to action, conscience at work in these activist sites of history. It's also, I think, a piece of video that's significant as a part of the increasing importance of the African American landscape in the United States. I think what we have now compared to 50 years ago, if you were an anthropologist from Mars and came to the US 50 years ago and charted the landscape, the historic landscape, and you came now, it would be a breathtaking change. Excavations of slave quarters at so many places, interpretive programs at former plantations and presidents' homes with slaves and calling them slaves or enslaved people, not servants, using the active voice and not the passive voice. Jefferson did this, Jefferson ate here, Jefferson wrote here. The house was built by servants. Just that change. Where do you go into plantation sites? What if you shift the focus and you don't go in the front door, but you go in the back door? What if you look at the building the first time from where the slaves' quarters had been? All of this creative dislocation that's going on at historic sites joins with this kind of creative dislocation of American story. Even now, on the United States landscape, our most indigestible stories that stick like a fishbone in our throat are spectacle sites of lynching. And even this landscape is now being explored. Graves are being uncovered. People in photographs are being identified. Anonymous victims in photographs are being named. Rituals of reconciliation are being held. Even this, and there's a whole new generation of scholars now at work on the history of lynching. We're publishing in December of this year a new State of the Field essay on the new generation of lynching scholarship in the United States. And this landscape of African American history extends far beyond the borders of the United States, as the late historian Nathan Huggins reminds us, framing the slave castles in West Africa as pilgrimage sites for America. He calls them, and these are his words, points of departure, not arrival, places of despair rather than liberty. They are the few physical remains of the traffic in human beings that brought many Americans, Black Americans, to the United States. They are, he declared, as much a part of our nation's history as Plymouth Rock. I want to think with you about one site of memory, the ruins of a store in Money, Mississippi. Some of you know the story, I'm sure. We're on a summer day in 1955, 14-year-old Chicago teenager Emmett Till allegedly whistled at the wife of the store owners and was murdered. This became, of course, a huge event. He was buried in an open casket in Chicago. It's a story that went underground for some years and has reemerged with a tremendous amount of attention, scholarship of all kinds. What interested me as I thought about the site, and I was at the store in Money a few years ago, and what's so interesting is it's remembered intensely because it's forgotten. In other words, the ruins of it are emblematic of how we have treated these kinds of sites. But there are two writers, Richard Rubin in Confederate Silence, a two-tale of the New Old South, and Paul Hendrickson's Sons of Mississippi. Both of them use the store as a place of memory, but also a place revealing processes of forgetfulness, because it's not recalled in any official manner. Both begin with detailed physical descriptions of the ruins of the store. Hendrickson, it's made of wood and brick and cinder block, but from across the road it seems like something almost papery as if from a dream. Once it was a Delta grocery store. Now it's a falling down building in an all but deserted place called money. But it is its own kind of American shrine. Nearly every Mississippi story, sooner or later, touches this one. Ends up in some spiritual homing way right here. And he observes, there's no plaque from a state historical commission. It just is. A monument in ruin, forgotten, recalcitrant, collapsing in on itself, set against the memory and the wind of these 5 decades of change and non-change in American race relations. Reuben went off into the store and, in his mind's eye, tried to recreate the scene as it was. His words, I would search the dirt on either side of the front steps, trying to discern where the tables had been, and after a short while I would slowly and with a false and shallow calm saunter on into the store itself and greet the clerk behind the counter, this is when it was still open, and engage in meaningless conversation for no other purpose than to allow me to study the counter itself and silently postulate. She stood there, a little to the left probably, and he stood here, right on this spot where I am, right now, right here. He found out that Roy Bryant, the store's owner, ran a store in the nearby town of Ruleville, and Reuben went there. I imagined I was about to get close to some sort of pure historical evil, the kind that people read about for many centuries afterwards, but can never really hope to understand or even envision. I wanted to get as close to it as I could. Here we have the sensory dimension of history, that it's not just sight, it's not just sound, but to touch the past, to be at these places, to go to Tuskegee, to go to these places and think here about coming into contact with some ultimate evil. But I could change just a few words here, and it would be somebody going to Gettysburg or to Pearl Harbor to go out to the USS Arizona Memorial and watch the oil that still comes out of the ground. It could be someone that goes to the Little Bighorn and looks at the graves of the 7th Cavalry and looks at the few graves where Indians are buried, or to touch the past at the new Indian Memorial there. It could be in the offices of so many of my colleagues and friends at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Almost all of them have something from Eastern Europe in their office. That it's important to have the physical remnants of the past here. I wanted to get as close to it as I could. Isn't this a statement common to a pilgrim, a tourist, an evocative ruin where something important happened? Or perhaps for a voyeur, because we can imagine the pornography of violence and to revel in the mind's eye of the spectacle of it all. And for the consumer, another place digested perhaps with easy comments about the lessons of history. Is the site more effective for being forgotten? And now, ironically, cast as a highly publicized forgotten site. Is it evocative because it is in ruins? And what to do with these ruins? The challenge of the site and the story. And I think for all of these stories on the African American landscape, the real challenge is not just to present them. We still have much more work to do on that in the U.S., but to braid them together so that it's not telling a story of African American history, but American history. How do we braid them? How do we keep these stories from being segregated on interpretive tours at these places themselves? That's an incredible challenge, it seems to me. Some years ago, I was doing a talk at Harper's Ferry as part of a larger celebration, and there were some historical reenactors that came and did a somewhat playful Washington and Jefferson and answered questions from the audience. It was okay, but it wasn't anything special. And then there came a breathtaking African-American reenactor who did Frederick Douglass. and it was absolutely stunning. Almost no one stayed for him. After Washington and Jefferson left, everyone else left as well. Now, it was presented, but that's segregated memory. Okay, obviously, I'm happy to talk more about some of the issues that arise from this little case study. Now, this is a 12-minute film called Testimony. There are some excerpts that I put together from the Testimony film, which is the last film, I'm sure some of you have seen it, at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C.
Now, my mother was very Orthodox. Mrs. Orlewska was deeply religious, and she respected my mother's religion also. She knew that it had to be kosher. So she took one pot, which she said she'll scrub it up real good, and she won't use any fat at all. So she cooked potato soup for us every single day. She browned some flour first, never touched, and she had one spoon. She bought a new spoon, and she had this one pot, which she always used only for us. My mother didn't have any unkosher food for the duration of the hiding. Never in her life, for that matter. But this is how she respected my mother's religiousness. And my mother would say, take a little money from this. She would not accept. And Mama would say, take a little money when you go to Mass and give it to the poor. And she would say, there are no poorer people than you. You children have no fresh air. You have no light. You have no freedom. Nobody is poorer than you. She wouldn't take a penny. Never. She never took a penny. She did it out of the goodness of her heart. She was incredible. And we didn't even have a chance to thank her. Because after the war, not after the war actually, after the liberation, when my mother went back to her, and just to tell her that we're going back to our hometown, and she says, please, don't stay in touch with me. Don't ever come back. I don't want my neighbors to see you. I'm afraid for the safety of my life. My Polish people, my Polish brothers, will not forgive me for saving a Jewish life. She was in jeopardy, and we never could say thank you.
It was a mood of expectation, and since it was Friday evening, after darkness fell in, one of the elderly ladies remembered that she had taken some candles along, and she was lighting the candles and saying the prayers. And we found this somehow encouraging, and though it's so absolutely irrational, almost irrational, that here, nobody knew about it, that 95% of the people on that train would not live to see the next evening. But nevertheless, people prayed, praising God for what?
When we arrived to Auschwitz, it was like we had just come into a different world. They opened up those cattle trains. People in striped uniforms came on the train, and they started to shout, we should get out and leave everything behind. People with children are going to be killed the same day. And as soon as my mother heard that, she had presence of mind to run down. And I was next to my mother, and I couldn't really believe that this could possibly be true. But she ran over to my sister, removed the child from her arms and told her, darling, I just found out that women with children will have it very easy. All they will do, they will take care of the children. But young people will be sent on hard labor, and I'm not so young, I'll never be able to survive hard labor. So she was trying to make my sister believe that by giving her the child, she's going to help her. Before my sister had even a chance to resist or to say, no, I don't want to give the child up, my mother had the child in her arm, and she was pushed to the side where all the women with children and older people were standing.
Cecilia's mother gave her daughter Mina, age 22, a chance to live by taking Mina's young son Danny into her arms. This photograph is of Cecilia's mother, Reisel, and Danny shortly before they were gassed.
My mother had only a chance to yell out to me, please take care of your sister. My name was Silly. This is how she called me. And she called out, Silike, take care of your sister. Because she knew the pain my sister will suffer, and she'll find out where she took her grandson.
It was a tremendous click as the gates closed, sort of a finality. And there stood a woman, clad all in black. And she was literally barking. I've never heard a human voice being that harsh. She looked like a bulldog, and I said, this is going to be absolutely the worst. We were supposed to refer to her as Frau Kügler. She turned out to be the hope, the inspiration, and the knowledge that perhaps not all Germans were cruel. She was a decent, wonderful, warm, caring human being. No doubt she was picked for her position because of her looks, but her looks completely belied what was underneath it all. She was decent, she was good. We stayed in that camp for a little over a year. No one was sent to Auschwitz. I don't know if she particularly loved us, but she pinned a lie to the lips of all those who said they had no choice. I personally am indebted to her for my own life at one point, when this infamous Lindner, who was known for his cruelty, swooped down for an inspection of the camp. And I had been very ill at the time. I was running a very high fever, and I was permitted to stay in my bunk. And she came in, there were 3 of us who were ill. And she came in, she said, girls, get yourself together. And I remember I had my skiing boots. See, my father made me wear my skiing boots when I left home, skiing boots in June. And I blessed him for it, because I wore those boots for 3 years in every season. I remember she stooped down to tie my boots, and she literally dragged me and the 2 other girls to the factory. She had worked in the factory before. And she set my looms in motion, and she said, pull yourself together, this is life or death today.
When I was arrested by Gestapo, and I was in this camp, my mother, who was in Budapest at the time, was approached that if she became an informer, they would rescue me, they would get me, which wasn't incidentally true. But it was a setup. She was on false papers, and she refused. And I'm proud of it.
The guidelines for this film were that they were to focus on themes of rescue, resistance, and defiance. And indeed, many of them do, if we saw the whole 117 minutes. But there's so much more that explodes on the faces, the words, and the silences of these people. We see survivors taken into the wormhole of memory, a different time and a different world. And it seems to me here the work of Lawrence Langer, particularly his book Holocaust Testimonies, The Ruins of Memory, help us think about an assumption that is a dangerous one, that memory and memory work is by definition healing, is by definition constructive. Memory work, as I've come to understand it, can rip communities and people apart every bit as much as it can put them together. And Langer suggests, and I'll go through these quickly, and we could talk about them more later, these different categories of memory that are not about redemption, that are not, as you find in too many Holocaust books in bookstores, that this is a story about the triumph of the spirit. Yeah. Listen to his categories and a brief description of each, and think if there's evidence of this in what you just viewed. Because in Langer's words, in this kind of oral history, we unearth a mosaic of evidence then constantly vanishes into bottomless layers of incompletion. Anguished memory. The seeds of anguished memory, he writes, are sown in the barren belief that the very story you try to tell drives off the audience you seek to capture. There's a frustration with a lack of common ground between the reality of the Holocaust and our attempts at imagination. You must understand, but you can't understand. Anguished memory, Langer writes, stains the desire for graceful aging with the refuse of annihilation zones and slaughter areas. 2, humiliated memory. An especially intense form, he says, of uncompensating recall. Instead of restoring a sense of power or control over a disabling a past, it achieves the reverse, reanimating the governing impotence of the worst moments, subverting what Langer calls the monumental view of the past, a stress on individual courage, faith in humanity, private will, the resolute deed, the triumph of the spirit. And he thinks about these more consolatory projects as preferred narratives, a term that I really love. And this is what he means by this. And this has been a paragraph that was important to me in writing my book on the Holocaust Museum in Oklahoma City, and certainly in my work at Flight 93. When we write of martyrs instead of victims, focus on resistance instead of mass murder, celebrate the human spirit and bypass the human body, invoke the dignity of the self and ignore its humiliation, we are initiating the evolution of preferred narratives that use embattled words to build buffers of insulation against the terrors of the Holocaust, or put something else in there if you wish, without bringing us any closer to its complex and elusive truths. Humiliated memory, Langer tells us, insists that while we may learn about the Holocaust, this learning cannot promote life and comes with the real cost. Another form of memory he writes about, tainted memory, a memory stained by the witness's own present moral sensibility. He writes, the survivor does not travel a road from the normal to the bizarre back to the normal, but from the normal to the bizarre back to normalcy, so permeated with the bizarre encounter with atrocity that it can never be purified again. Think of the brilliant ending of Maus 2, Art Spiegelman's cartoon history of the Holocaust, one of the most breathtaking creative works, I think, of our time. How does it end? Where Art Spiegelman's survivor father, Vladek, asks him to turn off the tape recorder. He says, I'm tired from talking Richelieu, and it's enough stories from now. He calls Art his murdered brother's name. The ghost of the murdered brother, still years later, infects the family. It's a stunning way, and that's the way the book ends. Not a redemptive narrative at all. Okay, obviously there's much more to say about that. I'd be happy to talk with you about the choices made at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. What does it mean to have a Holocaust Museum in America? In what city should it be? If it's in Washington, where? Should the architecture be expressive of the event? What's the definition of the Holocaust? What about a hierarchy of victims? What photographs do you use? What kind of artifacts do you use? What's the narrative? Every issue at the museum was a razor's edge issue. But we conclude, and then I'll have a few comments about this, and then Janet and I guess, will join in conversation with you. This is a 6-minute video from the Oklahoma City National Memorial with a different set of heroes. These are first responders from Virginia.
I was actually sitting in a barber chair getting my hair cut, and the news flash came over the TV.
And there was very sketchy, vague information of building. There had been a large explosion in Oklahoma City, and at that point, of course, it was unknown what had happened or why.
That afternoon when I got home and turned the television on and watched the news, I just couldn't believe what I was seeing.
Like everybody, I guess, in the country, we had a hard time believing that this would happen first on American soil, and also that it would happen in a place like Oklahoma City.
I wanted to go. It's what I trained for.
Our 64-person task force was activated actually on Sunday, and we went out of Andrews and flew into Oklahoma City.
We flew into Tinker Air Force Base, and our first impression was just an average American skyline. We were driving down a highway, and the first image you had of anything that was wrong was headlights. Everyone, as a show of support, was driving around with their headlights on.
When we turned the corner, my first approach to the Mirror building was just the amount of devastation.
There was just damage for blocks. It was just amazing to me that a bomb could do that.
The roof of one of the buildings completely blown off, the glass blown out of buildings for blocks away. It wasn't just seeing that building, but everything else combined with it that you didn't see.
Despite all of the work that we had done and all the drilling, we weren't prepared. Nobody was. You had a fairly confident, highly skilled, well-trained group of rugged individuals that turned that corner, and you could have knocked them over with a feather.
From the time we get there until the time we leave, our sole purpose is to find someone alive in that building.
There were people on that pile 24 hours a day in an active rescue. When you're doing a rescue effort, you're literally hand-picking it to make sure you don't do any further damage to someone who may be there.
We worked side by side with the Oklahoma City firemen.
These guys had been on that pile out there. We called them the ants because they were on that pile from the moment it happened until after we left.
We had specialized tools and equipment and training in how to remove the concrete, remove large slabs, cut small holes, what have you, and use searching devices.
It was an emotional roller coaster because you'd get your hopes up that maybe one of the sounds that you heard on one of the listening devices or one of the things that you saw on one of the cameras might be a live victim. And we never lost the hope that there would be somebody else in that building alive that we would find.
Oklahoma City Fire Department wanted to specifically remove every victim from the building. They felt that these were their citizens and they wanted to take them out.
The daughter of an Oklahoma City firefighter had been killed in the building. And when we discovered her body and when they were removing her body, we shut the site down. Just out of respect for a brother firefighter.
That is probably the hardest thing about this incident is we were not able to rescue anyone from the structure.
It was amazing that during a time when so many people were hurt and so many people were emotionally involved with what happened out there, that they could pull together and act as a team, come together and as a family and support the rescuers and support all the people that were working out there, and also support the families of the injured and the people who lost their lives.
I'll never forget when we checked in that night, they said, okay, you're going to be on this third floor up here in this large room. And they took the cots up there, and these women said, well, we'll make those cots up for you. And to us, that was very strange. I mean, here we're in a city who's been devastated. I mean, they have 160 some of their people missing, and there are these ladies here who literally want to make up our cots for us.
They had volunteers that would come and pick up our dirty clothing, take them home, launder them, and bring it back. So by the time we woke up, all our clothing was laundered.
We had one of our guys walking around one night, and a lady stopped who was one of the ladies cleaning tables. And she says, can I get you anything? Do you need anything? And he looks at her utterly incredulous, because there's absolutely nothing you could have asked for. And he's bald. And he goes, well, you know, I could use a haircut. And he laughs and chuckles and moves on. We came in from the site the next day, and they had a barbershop set up.
They gave you, I mean, they would give you anything. They'd give you the shirt off their back if they thought it would help you.
They just came together, and instead of that bomb destroying that city, it brought out so much love in that city that it was overwhelming. And that is what I will never forget about that, is the way those people in that city came together.
The people of Oklahoma City and the firefighters that work in Oklahoma City are the strongest people that I've ever met.
When I began working on The Unfinished Bombing, Oklahoma City in American Memory, I thought of it as a book that would be about the memorialization of the bombing, but it quickly became a book about the aftermath of an American city after a terrorist attack. In a terrible kind of timing, the book came out a week before 9/11. But I thought to myself, in the early months in Oklahoma City, the different storylines, the different narratives, and several of them you hear here, there was a storyline of civic renewal. Yes, it was horrible, but we're Oklahomans, we'll go on, we'll rebuild, we are strong. The personal stories, you know, one of the dangers of doing this stuff is you become cynical and sort of distrust some of these stories. But the stories of people driving up to the site in ramshackle cars, obviously with no money, and they had made huge piles of sandwiches, or people bringing clothes, or random acts of kindness from near and far, because people from around the world were enfranchised through the media to this event. And you had very touching kind of examples of no person being an island, and of course you also had the fact that these events bring out a lot of craziness in people as well. But there's often this kind of collective effervescence after these things, that this disaster is going to bring us all together. Our blood's all the same. It trumps race, it trumps class, it trumps everything. And sometimes there can be enduring things that last. Oftentimes it goes away. I asked an African-American city councilwoman about the kind of rhetoric that race relations had changed for the better after the bombing. And she sort of smiled and said, well, you know, for a while people talked like that, and then she said everyone went home, which I thought was an interesting way of putting it. There was a narrative of religious redemption as people struggled in many different faiths to mobilize their religious resources, their communities, to think about the problem of evil, to give some kind of framework to shattered lives, to invest the catastrophe with some kind of meaning. There was, and in some ways I think the book is named really for this, there's a narrative that we like to forget, and that's the toxic narrative. how these events live on and on and on, and that surviving survival is often a real challenge. The way that these events live on in the bodies and the minds and souls of so many. And then there was a fairly insidious narrative that's everywhere now, and that's the therapeutic narrative, that these people who are victims of political violence are patients who are ill. And they have to seek out the new priests of the therapeutic kingdom, grief counselors and the like, who will unlock the answer to their illness for them. And this goes along with the language that for me is like nails on a chalkboard. Closure, without question, one of the most obscene words in the English language. And healing process. Closure. So there's a time to grieve, but then if you grieve too long, you're ill. And who determines that time and the limits of grief? There were African American families who, when they told their loved ones had in fact been identified, everyone went to this one church to be notified, were falling on the ground and expressing their grief in physical expression. And oftentimes the mental health workers had to be physically kept from sedating them. Right? This was the kind of thing that that went on. Or healing process, as if grieving is a series of stages that you can chart, rather than being like a virus that circles and erupts in all kinds of ways. There are also preferred narratives, and this was true in 9/11 as well, that try and nationalize these events and turn people who were murdered in these acts into sacrificial patriots. Now, without question, the people who went into the towers in New York did in fact offer their lives in sacrifice. The people that chose to stay with people in the towers and keep them company in death did in fact sacrifice themselves. Nurse Rebecca Anderson, who ran into the Murrah building and was killed by falling debris. But other people just went to work. And at the 5th anniversary of the bombing in 2000, the dedication of the memorial, President Clinton came and said the following: "There are places in our national landscape so scarred by freedom sacrifice that they shape forever the soul of America. Valley Forge, Gettysburg, Selma. This place is such sacred ground." Well, these words really grated on me. However well-meaning, they seem profoundly misleading and, frankly, immoral. Because when you apply these kinds of narratives, you are taking away some of the power, the disruptive power of these events to offer soothing words that are, frankly, dishonest. These people's lives were not given in an act of conscious sacrifice for the nation. They were taken in an act of mass murder. The landscape to which Oklahoma City and 9/11 is connected is not Valley Forge, not Gettysburg, not Selma, but sites of political terrorism and mass murder. The 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The McDonald's in San Diego. Columbine High School. A wife of a Secret Service agent who I came to know, I wanted her to read this part of the chapter because I wondered if I was being too harsh, if I was being too critical. Her husband had just transferred from Washington to Oklahoma City a few weeks before and had been murdered in the building. So I sent her the stuff that I've just read to you, and I said, "Will you look at this, Pam, and tell me what you think?" And she sent me, I think, one of the most breathtaking things that I've ever read. "You are right that my husband was always prepared to give his life for others. He once told me that he believed he would die young in the line of duty. I do not think this was in any way an honorable or constructive way to die, or what any law enforcement person would choose as a way to give his life. Here's where my anger comes in. He was always prepared to defend the innocent or put his life on the line to protect. He was given the opportunity to do neither in this situation. I believe we heal better when we accept the truth. This was nothing more than a damn waste of lives. All the more worthy of our heartbreak, and the families all the more worthy of our sympathy." Her response is, I think, a magnificent example of the integrity of memory, of how someone seared with recent loss has the moral courage to resist the allure of preferred narratives. Well, I have no conclusion to this, and I know we're going to continue our conversation. I end this in the same way that Claude Lanzmann ends his brilliant 9.5-hour film Shoah, as the trains that had taken so many people to their deaths continue to rumble on as the film ends, taking people either to safe destinations or not. And so we too rattle and clatter on as best we can. Thank you.
Hi, sweetie.
You go sit down now.
Shall we sit? Ah, yes. Did I do okay? I did all right, huh?
Did excellent. So, I'm supposed to get some papers here for questions and stuff. I know that, well, I can hardly imagine that you don't have comments and concerns and questions that you'd like to have with Ed, so do bring them up. I do want to just have a couple of quick words. One is Jim Blight is a very bad boy and a very lovely husband, and I appreciate and was shocked. But it's also a good reminder. There's a lot of drugs inside me, poison and steroids that are fighting, and I never know which one's going to win at any moment. So I may end up talking and figuring blah, blah, blah. Ed will rescue me and take care of that. So let me take the prerogative before I get my papers of asking a question or two to Ed, that steroids one, poison one on that one.
I like Fred too. That's a good guy.
To Ed, that came up actually just in the last line, where you were talking about that wonderful response that you got from the widow. And it reminded me of something that you've all seen. I didn't know they were going to be playing this, but just before, while people were sitting before we came, they were playing excerpts from a presentation that Jim and I did on World War I. And we ended it with Harry Patch, who you're very familiar with. And Harry Patch says that basically war is a mechanism of destruction, a condoned mechanism of destruction for human beings. And it has no real good purpose. And he talks about World War I, 80 and 90 years later, as being absolutely worthless. I mean, it wasn't worth anybody's life, it wasn't worth his friend's life, and so on and so forth. And what was stunning to me was that he became a celebrity after he was 100. He never said a word about this for 80 years. He became a celebrity at 109, I think he wrote his memoir. He died at 111. He had a very widespread fame by that time and quite an impressive funeral. Prince Charles was there, and Tony Blair, and Gordon Brown. They all gave these eulogies. Not a single one got Harry's point. Harry was the brave young soldier who went to war and valiantly fought, which he did. That was Harry's story. 100 years later, it was impossible for a politician to say World War I was a waste. I expect that part of what underlies the woman's point is that it's impossible politically to say that Oklahoma was a waste of lives. It wasn't. So could you talk about how the power that, in a sense, overrules the obvious that's in front of you, how strong that is? Is there a way, other than individuals that say these things, can make a dent in it?
Yeah, I struggle with that, Janet. I think what I'll say about that is when somebody like Pam
Whicher says that about her husband, it has an incredible power, because any politician that would say, to contradict her is going to look like a fool.
But he won't.
And insensitive.
He'll ignore it.
Well, but a lot of people won't. I think it depends who says it. It makes a big difference if I say it or if Pam says it. It makes a big difference if, and there's contestation and all this stuff, if Vietnam veterans are the ones that protest certain aspects of the war versus people who were not there. So I think there's who says things that are not politically popular is really crucial.
And do you feel like there's some movement or some, you were talking about how if a Martian came over years ago and then now they'd notice some differences, how long will it take for a Martian to come here and notice some of those differences?
Well, in some ways, I think the U.S. does very well in recognizing its own indigestible stories. When you have places like Manzanar, a place of Japanese Americans of Japanese ancestry internment, the Sand Creek Massacre site, the horrific massacre in 1864 of Cheyenne. These are part of the National Park Service. They are, by definition, part of our national memory. I think that's something. There are always going to be, the contending voices, particularly when it comes to, textbooks and things like that. This is going to be always contentious. But I actually think that in a good many ways, we've come a hugely long way.
So when you say contentious, contentious, but it's sort of a minority that's, it's David and Goliath still, or is there, because
It depends on the issue.
Yeah.
It depends, it totally depends on the issue.
But there are sort of gradations where you think the less popular narrative has some sway.
Yeah. And I think there was a huge controversy not so many years ago about talking about slavery at Civil War sites. There's a news flash, right? Slavery had something to do with the American Civil War. Wow. Never knew that. And there was a huge uproar about this. You're going to be politically correct. You're revising history. This is just about the battles. You're caving into African-American sensibility. Well, and the parks were very smart. They used the words of people themselves, talking about why they were fighting and why secession came. And it turns out that the American public and whoever else went there were perfectly capable of, reading words of people at the time and making their decisions about what they thought. So while there was a lot of fuss and feathers, they turned out to be very, very good and appropriate revisions of stories. And all historians revise, right? If you don't revise, you're intellectually senile. Revisionist historian, Dave Welch and I were talking about this on the podcast today. Any of you go to a doctor and recoil in horror because a doctor doesn't put leeches on you? You say, oh my God, he gave me penicillin. He's a medical revisionist. Of course historians revise things. What if a new cache of information comes open about the Civil War? And this stuff happens all the time. Or I use the example today about the Holocaust. Eastern Europe opens up after the fall of the Soviet Union. We are learning so much now about the Holocaust in the former Soviet Union and Belarus and all of these countries. So if you're a Holocaust historian, you're supposed to think, man, I'd love to go look at those files. But doggone it, if I do, I'm going to have to revise some stuff, and that will make me a revisionist, so I just won't go. Well, that's just dopey. So this is one of the most ignorant comments. That's just revisionist history. Well, look, history is by definition revising. The second historian was the first revisionist. Maybe they do it well, maybe they don't do it well. but it's not frozen. We don't look at George Washington through the eyes of Parson Weems.
Let's hope. Mm-hmm.
So, and what happens sometimes is that these narratives get naturalized. Something is interpreted the same way for so long, it's not an interpretation anymore, right? It's the way things are. And the giveaway for me always is somebody who says, it's a well-known fact. What it's a well-known fact means, I was brought up believing this, and I don't want you cluttering this up because I've already got it put away on the bookshelf where it's supposed to be. It's great stuff to think about.
There's some great questions here, but I have to do a quick follow-up on this point, because the historians, I mean, you are so crucial, obviously, in this whole process of educating us on, as Jim said, things that in principle we don't remember, we can't remember, right? So we need this kind of stuff. But historians can also be those academic people that are at that conference that you hated to go to, and so forth. So how do you talk about sort of the influence of historians on real people, on kids growing up, on people doing their shopping, on bankers, on other people? I mean, how do we know the good stuff that you have?
Yeah, I think there are quite a number of historians who enjoy working in public, who enjoy writing for the public. I think if someone, wants to be a scholar and write specialized books for specialized audiences, that's great. I think it's always a challenge, and I think it makes me sad that there's so much wonderful history being written that people don't read. And I don't know what to do with that. But on the other hand, despite the flaws and faults that people find and stuff, you have people like Ken Burns and others who are wonderfully important, and people associated with the National Park Service.
Yeah.
So I think there, and all kinds of other organizations, the American Association for State and Local History, the National Council on Public History, and the fact that there's contention, well, that's what we do, so we do what we do. Now I do, once in a while when I get really tired of a certain kind of academic discussion, as I said in my email to you, and someone asks me at a conference if I'm doing a paper, well, Professor Linenthal, what's your methodology? I will gently say, well, I had one, but I lost it in an infection. So,
The leeches got it.
Yeah. I mean, you can't take that stuff too seriously.
Okay, let's go to some questions here.
Questions?
Oh, I'm sorry?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So can you comment on the value of media in documenting stories versus the role of media in fueling and shaping stories related to violence?
Wow. There are many, many people who can do both parts of that a lot better than I can. What I can say, and this comes from my experience in Oklahoma City, is how interesting it was, and I don't mean this in a cynical way, that the media, somewhat cynical with the media and family members used each other. Family members, many of them, not all of them, were interested in telling their stories to the media because they were ways of doing public eulogies for their loved ones. And the media was happy, to do this. The media enfranchised people all over the world to be a part of this for good and for ill. But there absolutely was a kind of voyeuristic part about this. I'm not going to say the name because I don't have confirmation about this, but one of the kind of talk show people on TV at the time was caught dressed as a priest trying to smuggle in a camera into the First Christian Church where family members were waiting to receive words of their loved ones. And the medical examiner told me that they had to put up curtains in the morgue because news people were climbing up in the trees trying to film the bodies through the tops of windows. Family members were affected by the enfranchisement of many, many people. Mothers of murdered children were stalked. People fell in love with mothers. People sent money to Oklahoma. People came to Oklahoma City acting as if they knew these people, but they really didn't. So there was all of that, and the media also, in too many instances, used this language of therapy to ask, of course, just the stupidest questions. Like, well, it's the 5th anniversary now. Have you reached closure on the death of your daughter? What's the answer that we want there? Right? What's the only newsworthy answer? Yeah, I guess so. I'm going to go play 18 holes. I don't really think about her anymore. I mean, nobody's going to say, but this is just nonsensical. Well, no, it's not. It's borders on the obscene.
Worse than that.
So there was that kind of gossipy stuff going on as well. But it was very powerful when family members used the media to do public eulogy, because it seemed to me that the emphasis now in modern memorialization on faces and names and stories, and this is true in Oklahoma City, it's absolutely true at 9/11 sites, is a kind of memorial protest against the anonymity of mass death in our time. Damn it, these people are not going to be forgotten. We're going to remember how they lived, we're going to remember who they were, we're going to remember who their families were, all of those things.
It's certainly human and reasonable and expected that, at that time of maximum grief, all you're feeling are the wondrous aspects of that person, right? And so the eulogies, as they always are, or mostly are eulogies of these people that really weren't, in a sense. They're so idealized, and they're true parts to them, but they're only parts.
Yeah.
And I'm remembering that when Robert Kennedy was murdered, Ted Kennedy said something that stuck with me, that my brother does not need to be remembered as only a person who did X, Y, Z. In general, he was a good and decent person, but he was a complex person. That's impossible, right, in those moments of
I don't know if it's impossible. I'm not sure. Yeah. I think it can be done.
Yeah. Let me pick up again on this issue of media. People in conflicts can rapidly now share grief and violence via social media. However, trending topics move on quickly. Can you comment on discordant narratives of war in the digital social space? And is there sort of a timeline of sort of, well, they'll peak and then they're gone. It's another story that pulls them off page one.
Yeah, this is sort of why I'm glad I'm retiring fairly soon, and I'm not trying to be flippant about this at all. I'm really not. But I can't comment on this because I don't understand social media very much. I understand its significance in terms of awakening people to all kinds of things, but I don't use it. I don't study it. I don't have a good feel for it. It's a wonderful question, and there are people who can answer that, but I'm not one of them.
Okay. Honest man. I'm not either, by the way. Truth be told,
you have
I
a slide projector is still cutting edge technology for me, so that's part of the problem.
I have a two-part question here related to Tuskegee. One is a fairly simple part, and then a broader leap. So a person here asks, my understanding is that the Tuskegee Airmen were actually one of the most decorated Air Force units in the country. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And so all the more bizarreness and sadness of the Alpha to Omega. You talked to part two, when you had that first very moving clip up there of their return to the South. You talked about that for you now as a way to add discordant sound, a discordant voice to the so-called good war. So it seems that to this person that, in a sense, every war has those discordant voices in there. But we still talk about the good war. We still talk about good parts of war. We still talk about the valiant war. We almost have to talk about a valiant war. And that discordant voice never comes in real time. It comes in later, it comes in lower. How do we get, since this happens again and again and again, Tuskegee is not an outlier in that way.
Yeah.
How do we get that point really into action, into the fiber of society?
Well, boy, if I knew the answer to that. I think it's difficult because you've got people in harm's way and people invested in, when they die, making that blood sacrifice meaningful. And too often the discordant voices come across as unpatriotic. African Americans in World War II, though, with the double V, victory at home and victory overseas, could make a claim, that patriotic claim: we're ready and willing to fight for our country, but we also want to be treated as full citizens. Right? That our blood means something. But it's also a little bit sad that the price for being a full citizen is you have to prove it by dying in a war. It seems to me there are other more enlightened ways of, becoming citizens. But
like voting.
Yeah. I think this clip and others like it are wonderful tools. Studs Terkel, I'm sure many of you know his book, The Good War, an oral history. And the good war is in quotation marks because of the irony that he brings to it for these kinds of reasons. And I want my students to think about that, to think about World War II as a necessary war. But how do you call a war good that killed 55 million people, that brought the Holocaust, that brought the bomb? I want them, and I had to struggle with this when I was on the original advisory committee for the ill-fated Enola Gay exhibition at the Smithsonian. I've actually moved some ways in my thinking about the bomb, and I ask students to think about occupying a very difficult space and then working within that space, that the bomb can be conceived as both necessary and unacceptable at the same time. And that's a really interesting tension. And in some ways, that's where I find myself.
Yeah.
And sharing those tensions and, telling students that you're struggling and occupying those places kind of gives them license to thicken and complicate and contradict their own sense of this. I think it's important for American students to understand that there was an Eastern Front where, oh, by the way, just a few people were killed, right? That not only Americans were involved in D-Day, that there were Canadians and French and Brits, and that the Eastern Front was a war of absolute vast monstrosity. And they don't know this, because the view of war is constricted by various media representations of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Another two-part question for you. So in your work with families of disaster victims, or any of the projects actually, are you ever called upon to mediate between groups who are battling each other over how to memorialize the victims? That's sort of part one. And following from that, part two, is if you are in some of these discussions that you have with the people involved, does it ever get to the issue of a discussion of, well, what are some of the root causes for this tragedy?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. nobody's ever asked me that before. I have not been involved as a formal mediator because I'm usually a kind of fly on the wall. I'm listening. I did bring family members and members of the community in Shanksville who were involved in the memorial. We went to Oklahoma City for 3 days, and I organized a meeting between these people and family members, survivors, other people who were involved in the Oklahoma City National Memorial. It was a breathtaking experience, listening to two communities of people who knew each other even though they had never met. It was quite something. I've been involved a little in conversations with Norwegian colleagues over the past year, and will continue to be, over the memorialization of the terrorist attack in Norway in 2011 on the government center in Oslo, and the massacre of the 69 labor youth on the island of Utøya. And again, it's fascinating to talk with these people, but I don't mediate. What I can't say, though, it's just something I would like to say here, is in Oklahoma City, and then a very different role when I was on the Flight 93 Federal Commission, and I played a very modest role on this commission. I had never done that before. I mean, I was doing part of something that I had only written about before. But think about, in Oklahoma City, this is a community seared with the death of 168 people, the injuries to hundreds and hundreds of more people, children orphaned, and the Memorial Task Force starts 2 months after the bombing. And so many people are already entrenched. Only this kind of memorial can do justice to my loved one, right? So that any deviation from that is seen as a sign of disrespect to their loved one. So you've got irreducible, non-negotiable positions. Well, you can't do a memorial process that way, right? It's not going to work. I want 168 hearts, I want 168 trees, I want 168 lights, on and on and on. So all of these people, family members and then survivors who gradually came, had to enter into a process where they learned that the memorial was not about them, it was about future generations, that none of them were going to get exactly what they wanted. I mean, they did what Washington can't do, and they did it seared with the impact of violence. They compromised and they practiced the arts of democracy. And I thought it was absolutely breathtaking undertaking. And Oklahoma City did have, I think, a major influence on how Shanksville went about it. And they went about it mindfully and thoughtfully as well, because there are always these questions that are so difficult. What do you do if you're on a memorial commission and there's a family whose loved one was murdered on Flight 93, and they absolutely know that their loved one was leading the charge in the cockpit. And they want that stated. What do you do? I mean, there's a whole world of hurt behind that. How do you negotiate that? Something I never would have thought about in Oklahoma City. We were watching oral history of family members. And Bob Johnson asked the question of the filmmaker, do you have something of everyone you interviewed in the stuff that's going to go in the memorial center? He said, no. There has to be something of everyone. And you know why there has to be something everyone? Here's why there has to be something of everyone. Again, every issue is a razor's edge in this stuff. And the problems come from area you don't even think about unless you're so sensitized as he was to this. The wife of the governor at that time in Oklahoma, Kathy Keating, was a wonderful, wonderful woman, did a book of, she asked for family members to write biographies of their loved ones who were murdered and put them in a book, and the money from the book went to scholarships and all of that. But she did this with the best of purposes. But for length reasons, I guess, she didn't use all the stories.
Oh my God.
And there's a transcript in Oklahoma City that I read of a meeting between her and the mother, someone who I came to know, whose adult daughter was murdered in the building. And it's really interesting. This has never happened before. My memory of that transcript is that it's red, but it's not red. It's black. But the passion of this was red. And the mother said to Kathy Keating, I stayed up for 2 nights to write this, and you didn't put it there. You murdered my daughter again. These are the stakes. You know, so when you read names at a memorial, you damn well better have all the names. But what if you have families who want to have names on a memorial, and there's argument about names, maiden names, for example. What do you do in Oklahoma City when the mission statement said there will be a survivor wall nearby but separate from the memorialization of those who were murdered? The 168 chairs, the lighted chairs, they're absolutely breathtaking, with the names on the front and smaller chairs for the 19 children who were murdered. If you're going to have a survivor wall with names on them, what do you have to do? You have to define who is a survivor. How do you do that? What is the experiential boundary? What is the physical boundary? Who gets to be on that? This is incredibly difficult stuff. The 9/11 Museum they've had to deal with so much, but the inclusion of human remains in that complex has been a very, very difficult process. I'm sorry, I'm telling stories.
We're going to get to that one on
Yeah.
our last question in a minute, but yeah, I mean, we could all go on, my God, and I get you for more time, so I'm excited. CBC journalist Michael Enright spoke of a very thin membrane between remembrance and glorification. Increasingly, I feel that Memorial Day is slipping into glorification of war again. How can we stop this train?
Wow. A thoughtful and articulate question. I think during times of war, glorification is part of what happens. I think the voices of poets and others who may ask us to have second thoughts often come later. I think the voices that will be effective in introducing notes of sobriety and humility to something like Memorial Day come from veterans themselves and their families. I think those are voices that are listened to. I mean, Memorial Day is a day that tries to make sense of sacrifice. And when a culture can't make sense of sacrifice anymore, it's got big problems.
For sure. Let me return to one quick question from before, and then there'll be a final question that's much more general.
Yeah.
In any of your work, any of the discussions that you've had with families and how they're negotiating what the memorial should be and so forth, and maybe even especially with the 911, which will lead to the general question that I'll end with, which was somebody who said, can you comment on the memorial for the Twin Towers? Can you think of any examples where the discussions get into what caused this?
Yeah.
Or is that just off territory for a while?
My one criticism of the first iteration of the Memorial Center at Oklahoma City was that it was as if the bombing dropped out of the sky.
Yeah.
there was no discussion really of domestic terrorism, Christian terrorism, remembering that Timothy McVeigh was a decorated Gulf War veteran, all those sorts of things. That's changed, and I think that's really good.
How did that come about?
The memorial evolved and understood that it was lacking a kind of context. And, context is chosen. They could have chosen other contexts, but this was a really important one. The 9/11 Museum, I know a little. I taught a Gilder Lehrman teacher seminar, 9/11 in American Memory, at the museum last summer, which was the first summer it was open, and I'll do it again next summer, and had a fair amount of time to spend in the museum, although it's so crowded. It's difficult
It's so what?
Crowded. It's difficult to spend lots of time, in any one section. They obviously talk some about the rise of Al-Qaeda. Part of the problem with doing what caused things is these are often bitterly divisive questions. So what do you privilege? What do you put forth? A kind of smorgasbord of stuff.
Do we cause anything?
Do you take things on in a certain way in the permanent exhibition? Do you let other things be dealt with in the bookstore where you have a good? These are really, really difficult kinds of questions. I think it would be a mistake for a museum to just claim with the hidden curatorial authority, 9/11 happened because of this. I mean, it would be suicide politically, and it would also be intellectually wrong.
Yeah, of
but
course.
there are ways certainly of talking about the stew.
So there are ways that people can sort of see different narratives, really, of what.
Yeah, and bringing people into the question. This is what's going on in the world. A whole bunch of seeds that could have germinated that may have led to 9/11. Which ones do you think are the most important? And let people think about it, read about it themselves, rather than presenting the museum as a place that answers questions, rather than brings people into the struggle to develop either proximate or, if their psychology is of that, final questions.
Unfair question, but just to follow up on one from the audience. What's your sense, though, on the 9/11 Museum? I mean, they had a lot to contend with. Overall, did they sort of perform pretty well, you
Well,
think?
they have an incredible amount to contend with,
Yeah.
and I'm probably not a objective observer because I have very close friends, who work there. I need to see it more before I really get a sense of being able to read it, in the way that I've been able to read the Holocaust Museum and other places. I don't know it well enough. I don't know it well enough. Then I think the Shanksville Memorial is going to be very compelling. It's a landscape memorial. It fits the environment really, really well. I hated the idea of the Freedom Tower, which is no longer called the Freedom Tower. I thought it was a kind of architectural triumphalism at its worst. That seemed to me, again, to not be humble and awe-filled in the face of what happened. I mean, this, after all, was a site of mass murder.
Yeah.
And, when you go to other sites of mass murder, you don't get a sense of triumphal architecture. I mean, I know this is Lower Manhattan, and that architectural language is really important, but for me, anyway, and it's maybe just a matter of, personal taste, that didn't sit well with me. Now, the building is there, it's huge, it's not called the Freedom Tower, so there we are.
There we are. And there we are. So thank you all, guys, for not going to Black Friday and coming to hear this. I think definitely Ed, oh my God, these poisons are doing bad things to me. I know. Anyway, I think that Ed is definitely he's our wedge into getting rid of Black Friday. So could we all just give
that's
him
awesome.
a big thanks?
Thank you, everybody. My pleasure.
Well, I have a couple of thank yous. First of all, I want to thank James Blight and Janet Lang for bringing Professor Ed Linenthal to Waterloo for this lecture. Our dynamic duo of history at the Balsley School, you've done it again and brought us an amazing event. So thank you for your able moderating. You're a real trooper. We all recognize that, and thank you, Jim. And then especially, Ed, for your words tonight to help us think about what our ways of remembering tell us about ourselves. And if I could just interject a personal note here, you know, I've always been fond of the historical stories of happy Dutch townsfolk turning out to thank their Canadian military liberators in World War II, because my parents were teenagers in the Netherlands under Nazi occupation, and I was born in Canada, so it seemed a nice sort of happy ending for my country of birth and my historical roots. But I was recently at a historical seminar at the War Museum in Ottawa to commemorate the 70th anniversary of that liberation. And a professor from the University of Leiden in the Netherlands reminded us of the stories from the south of the Netherlands where many Dutch citizens were angry at the Canadian military after the especially fierce fighting in the Scheldt area because they felt that destruction of their villages was more than was needed to get the Germans out. That's Canadian artillerymen bombarded villages and houses after the Germans had already left on the off chance there were still some there. And I was disturbed by that, you know, ripple in my happy narrative. But you've reminded us that revisionism based on true stories of people can be constructive, and that if we want to celebrate true stories of courage, then we also need the courage to seek truth. So thank you again for your remarks tonight. The edited video of tonight's event will be posted to the CG website. We also post blogs about our events where you can add your comments. And in the coming weeks, we invite you to join us for 2 more public events in the CG auditorium. On Tuesday, December 9th, please join us for the screening of Our Man in Tehran, a film documenting the events leading up to the 1979 Iranian hostage crisis in which Canada played such an important role. And then on December 11th, we invite you to join us for a special free noon-hour performance of the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony in concert here in the CG Auditorium. So be sure to register online for the CG Events newsletter to receive information on these and other upcoming events. Thank you for coming. Have a safe journey home.